Hello and welcome to this edition of the Legislative Reference Bureau's Oral History Interviews. Our guest today is Margaret Farrow, a former representative, state senator, and lieutenant governor. Welcome.
Well, good to be here.
You were born in Kenosha.
I was, and I'm very proud of it. Of Chicago parents. They had moved to Kenosha from Chicago.
Went across the border. What part of Kenosha did you live in?
I was out on the west side.
West side.
Which was the end of the city in my time, and now is halfway out.
Tell me a little about that place.
Well, it was an industrial town, very strongly industrial at the time. It still has some, but has changed. We had Nash Motors, which became American Motors, which became Chrysler. And we had a number of other, Snap-on was the one my dad came up from Chicago to join, and Snap-on Tools. And it had a very, kind of a miniature in a way of Milwaukee, in that we had Polish ethnic, we had German ethnic groups, we had a lot of Italians. It was a very large Italian population at the time I was there. And it was the type of, it had a couple bus lines to downtown and through the town. They were named by color: orange line, red line, green line. And I could get on one for 3 cents and ride downtown, and I did, I think, before I was 10. It was that kind of a comfortable place to have kids do things like that.
So it had different ethnic groups, and each in their different areas then? Or?
To some extent. There was somewhat of parts of the town, but they mixed pretty well too.
How did that place affect your outlook and your subsequent life as a public official? I ran across a clip where Joe Andreas said, "Now we have a second senator from Kenosha." When you were elected.
I'm very proud of it. You're right. When I was elected, Joe was in the Senate, and when I actually went from the Assembly to the Senate, he was the first to welcome me. And by then, we had already worked on a number of pieces of legislation for Kenosha. I knew that Kenosha was in its transitional point then, having lost a lot of their industry, and I was happy to work with them on that and with education things and a whole number of issues. And Joe and I got along extremely well. And that was back in the time when you were comfortable going across the aisle, more so than now, I'm afraid. And Joe and all three, Peter Barca and John Antaramian, were the trio from Kenosha. And then the other representative was Cloyd Porter, who was on the western side. He was the one Republican in that area at the time. And it was just a great place to grow up. I went to grade school there, but I went to high school in Racine because I'm Catholic, and the high school, to get a Catholic education at that level, an older brother, I have a 7-year older brother, he went before me, and there were 250 of us from Kenosha who went to St. Cat's at the time. And
did St. Joseph's not exist yet?
Nope, they did not exist. It started at St. Mary's Parish in Kenosha, a fledgling high school. In fact, I taught at it when I got out of Marquette briefly when my husband was in the Navy. And the pastor there wanted Kenosha to have a Catholic high school, so he started it. And then it grew from from St. Mary's into St. Joe's, and now that's adjusted a bit, and now it's an academy beginning at 6th or 7th grade up through high school. And St. Cat's is that way now too.
But when you were there was no St. Joe's, and
nope.
250 you bust up from Racine every day,
from different
Kenosha
parts of the
to
city.
Racine.
Yeah, different parishes, different parts of the city. And so it was a combination of things that I guess my 6th grade civics class at St. Mary's School on 39th Avenue is what turned me on to government. Somehow the flame went on, it still isn't out, and I was fascinated by government, all governments, and on policy and how public policy is made. I took every course in high school I could of any type of history, and then thought I'd major in history, but then I discovered political science, which in my era was pre-law. That's the only reason I took political science, because the high schools didn't teach it at the time, didn't have American government or what have you. So I went to a liberal arts school in Chicago, suburban Chicago, Rosary College for 1 year. Took a huge history course, an 8-credit survey course that was very mind-blowing, and I got the only A at semester, so I figured I was up to the task. And then I switched to Marquette and discovered political science as they were opening into a major program at that time. And I was in the first class that graduated with a major in political science. And people often ask my husband, John, did you know she was going to be like this when you married her? And he said, well, she majored in political science. It should have been a warning.
So from the 6th grade on, you have had this interest.
6th grade has started it, yes. And that's why I always say, and I did also major in elementary education because I couldn't go into secondary because political science wasn't a teaching major. And so I figured I'll hit the upper grades, the middle school, now what is called middle school.
So you were not headed to law school, you were looking to be a teacher all along?
No, not then. Later I had hoped to, but never quite made it, so I instead went to the legislature and wrote laws.
You went to Marquette, you got your
Yes.
degree at Marquette.
Yes.
And was your plan just to be a teacher at that point, or were you?
Well, no, I guess, that was what I knew if I had what I would make my living as, would be a teacher. I actually took the civil service exam for the federal civil service as I graduated from Marquette, and I got a good grade, and I had 3 openings immediately put in front of me, 1 in the Midwest and 2 out east. By then, my husband, we were engaged, and he had just left to join a destroyer moving out to the Pacific because he had an NROTC scholarship going through Marquette. So I waited, and he came home in December, and we got married, and the rest is history. I didn't have time to do any of that. I did do a lot of volunteer work, and I did do a lot of substitute teaching, but because he moved around for 4 years, I couldn't sign a contract to teach anywhere. I just subbed, and by the time we got back here, we had 1 child and another one on the way, and I became a full-time mom.
Your husband is John?
John, yes.
And what year were you married?
We were married, and you really want to know, 1956.
1956.
He keeps reminding the world it was a leap year. And though the younger generations don't realize it, that was a year where the women asked the men.
I see.
In leap year, women could ask men to get married, and he claimed I got him right at the end of the leap year. So,
any truth to it?
No. I asked his intentions after we had been dating 1 year, and the next year we were engaged. But we were married on December 29th because of the Navy. He flew in on a 48-hour pass from San Diego and never had a honeymoon.
Were you living with him at this time? I mean,
No.
I mean, after your marriage, were you moving around with him? Or?
Yes. Well, when the ship wasn't at sea, I mean, he was gone for 2 6-month periods, and then I came home and did some teaching, substitute teaching.
In what city?
In Kenosha.
In Kenosha.
In my parish, I taught the high school level,
Right.
and before that, I had filled in for one of the nuns up in Caledonia, on a church you can see, St. Louis and Caledonia. You can see it from the right from the highway. And I was teaching 4th grade there.
Okay.
So
then that was your life for a time. You had 5 children?
Yes, we had 2 that were 16 months apart, and then a couple of years later, twins, whose birthday was yesterday, as a matter of fact. And then almost 6.5 years later, we had the 5th son. And I was heading to law school at that moment, and decided, no, that wasn't going to work. And so, in fact, John Norquist and I took the LSAT together.
Really?
Way back, yeah, at Marquette when it was being offered. So, but I did do some graduate work at Marquette in public affairs journalism and more political science. So I kept trying to learn a little more, still learn a little more.
What did your husband do after he got out of the Navy?
He was an engineer.
I see.
And his engineering, he was an electrical engineer, graduated with a major in power, which at that time was one of the major fields in electrical engineering. Then it disappeared for decades. Now they're needing it again because power is becoming so critical in the forms of generation of it. So he went into industry when he left the Navy and was an engineer, and did a little design work at first, and then got into sales engineering and spent just over 22 years in engineering for private companies. The only job he could get getting out of the Navy was in 1960 during one of the recessions, was in Ohio, outside of Cleveland. So we lived there for about 18 months. And then he got another opportunity to come back to Milwaukee. And he's from Chicago, but never wanted to go back into Chicago. He stayed up in our neck of the woods. And after a couple of years, he started going to graduate school and tried a couple different paths, and finally realized he wanted to major in quality engineering and industrial engineering for his master's and the rest. And so to do that at Marquette, they didn't have industrial engineering. He went back there and took an mechanical engineering degree, under which he could take the courses he wanted to for quality control for the company he was working with at the time. And then went to UWM and got everything but the dissertation finished. And then Marquette got a grant from General Motors to start an industrial engineering program, and he applied to run it, thinking, probably no chance, and ended up being accepted and chosen, and had them up and running and accredited in 3 years more quickly than they thought they could do it. And so he was there for about 6, 7 years, And then they went into more graduate level work, and he left industry because he wanted to do something to improve undergraduate engineering with the type of engineers he was running into who were coming out with a lot of book learning but no practical knowledge. He'd start using terms in the plant, describing things to them, and they didn't know what he was talking about, but they probably could wire the circuit from a diagram in their textbook. And so he said, no, they've got to have a little bit of the mixture of both. So that's how he also had a passion, as I did, for public policy. He did for that. And he ended up going down to Milwaukee School of Engineering. And after a semester there, or a quarter thereon, they needed a new head of their mechanical engineering department and asked John to step in kind of temporarily while they looked around. And 11 years later, he told them, I'd like to go back to the classroom. After leading the department for 11 years, he was doing some teaching. And then at almost that same moment, Governor Thompson asked him to become one of the Public Service Commission members. I had been after him, Governor Thompson, for years, because I believe, if you look at the history of the Public Service Commission, it began to control our railroads. That's what it was founded for.
Railroad Commission.
Yeah, it was the first one in the country, and as we are with many things. And I believed we needed a mixture of talent and resource on that. Still do. I still believe that. And I think at least one of them should have a knowledge of the industries that they're regulating. And so I kept, every time Governor Thompson would appoint another lawyer, I'd go into his office and give him a hard time about it. I'd say, I know he's bright, I know he's smart, but they need more to blending. And so he came up to my husband at an event and said, you know, your wife's just killing me about this business of the Public Service Commission. And John said, well, I guess I agree with her in a way. And he said, well, I found an engineer and I'm going to appoint one. And John said, great, who? And he said, you. And I mean, that's how it happened. And it was probably the most least political appointment that was made to it, because, I mean, John was a total independent agent on that. No one ever spoke to him about what we'd really like you to do, John. It was none of that sort of thing.
He was perfectly open to that service?
He was, and go out and ask the staff who are still there, who were there when John was there. I mean, he could get them to have to look at twice, you know, because he understood what they were summarizing for him, you know, and it was a marvelous 3 years. He was filling out the end of a term, and but he was killing himself. He did not have an executive assistant. He did all his own reading. He did all his own research, and he literally was going to kill himself if he didn't either take an EA or we moved to Madison, because he was driving back and forth and all. And so he just took the 3 years, but he loved it, and he's still invited to every retirement party and everything out there. Their picnics and what have you, because they loved him too. He's a great guy. I married him because he's smarter than me. So he's been my mentor in a way, and my sounding board on a lot of things throughout my career, my side of the career.
So all these years he's working on his engineering degree, you are raising 5 sons.
Yes. Yes.
And you live in the Milwaukee area during this time?
At that point we did. We were we were in an apartment for a short time in West Dallas, and when we moved back here from Ohio, and then we were on Washington Boulevard, just west of the old, what used to be Washington Park Zoo, now the Washington Park area. And in fact, John Norquist, again, didn't believe I lived in Milwaukee, and he was doing doors when he was running for mayor the first time, and he came back to the Senate for a session, and he said, you did live in Milwaukee. And I said, you didn't believe me, John? And he said, I ran into some of your neighbors. So we had a great time about that. And then in 1967, because we had 4 sons by then, had lost 2 basement windows to ball playing in the backyard and what have you, we found a strange lot out right off Blue Mound Road in Elm Grove. And it was a little triangle. Nobody thought you could build on it. So we put an offer on it was also, we found out, the least expensive suburban lot in Milwaukee that year, because the end of the year they had a newspaper article saying, and the suburban lots ranged from $9,000 to I don't know what. This is back in 1967. And we said, that's ours. You
won the prize.
Yeah. And so we put an option in on the lot with the contingency that we could put a house on it, that it would fit, because there was a street on both sides coming to a point at the end. And it fit. We built our house, and we lived there for 31 years.
You're on Blue Mound Road in Elm Grove? And
we were at Watertown Plank Road. We were just a block north of Blue Mound Road.
And this is where your public career started?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, that was because there was a corner on the street that was behind our house where there was no right-of-way, I discovered, and the big arborvitae trees were right at the asphalt. And we had about 2,500 kids in the neighborhood, and they'd all come whipping their bikes around there. And the cars, it was kind of a good run-through street. It was Wisconsin Avenue. If you could get on it downtown in Milwaukee and drive straight out without interruption, that was Wisconsin Avenue.
Okay.
And but there was interruption, so you couldn't do that, of course. And I was very concerned. A number of the women were the stay-at-home moms, as we were. So I went down and checked into, could something be done to at least trim those trees and give a little more visibility? They said no, because the streets are platted on easements, but there's no easement there. The pavement goes to the property line. And I sat in on a few meetings and listening to what was going on and realized, wait a minute, that's what I'm interested in. And so I was in the League of Women Voters by then, the old league, the league that was made up of grassroots research and everything and not dictated from their Washington office. That switch came in the late 60s. It turned into a national group from a grassroots group. And so anyway, I was in the league, and we would have people go to the various meetings and bring reports back, what's going on in Brookfield, what's going on in Elm Grove. And I was the Elm Grove liaison, and I'd sit in the back of the room and listen. And they thought I was a newspaper reporter, because why else was I just listening? And people would come in and want to make a statement, and they could at a certain point in the agenda, and they'd come back to me and say, which one is, Bill Smith? Because there's no identification up at the podium, and there were 6 trustees, of course, and the president. So I finally got up once and went to the mic at the public speaking and said, I wish you gentlemen, and they were all men and always had been men, wish you'd put your names in front of you so I can stop telling your constituents who you are when they come in. And so lo and behold, I ran for office. I decided I could do that too. So I ran against an incumbent. And
what year is this now?
This was 1970.
70.
1970. And
what office, trustee?
A trustee.
Okay.
And one woman had before me, had run but not made it, and her name was Peg, and I was known as Peg at that time. My Margaret was Peg. And that's how I was raised. That was my nickname. And so I ran, and I ended up with coming within like less than 20 votes of an incumbent. It scared the living daylights out of everybody, I guess. I'd only lived in the village barely 4 years, I think. Like, what was this all about? And yet I didn't have any axe to grind. I just wanted to have, a piece of the development of public policy.
What did your campaign consist of?
Some pencils. I have them yet, some pencils with my name on it.
You're handing out pencils?
Yeah. And I went door to door, and I had a lot of coffees. And I think coffees are the best way to meet I still do. Up to and through State Senate, I think coffees in people's backyards or front living rooms are almost better than ringing doorbells, because people really get a chance to question you and think about it. They're coming knowing they're going to meet you instead of you taking them by surprise at the door. I swear people, are polite at doors, and then probably after you leave, about a half hour later, they'd say, gee, if I knew I was going to talk to that candidate, I would have asked, thus and such. But anyway, so I like to use my time productively, and that's why I like that. And so I came close, and so I ran the second time. Now, I had all these little...
This is the next year or 2 years later?
Yeah, next year,
Next
because
year.
they elect half the board each year, so I tried again the next year. And
the spring election, I
yes,
assume.
yes, and in February of that, February of that year, April election, I had our 5th son. Well, in Elm Grove, there's a beautiful historic building that's a convent built with funds from one of the Prussian princes or someone, and it looks like a Prussian castle. And I'm Catholic, so you go over there, and the candidates all have to make sure, because there's about 150 votes there. And so I made my usual visit. I went back to the convent and everything and made my second visit as a candidate, and I lost all their votes because I had this little baby at home. And apparently no one ever said that to me, but the vote drop was from that ward, and I swear they thought I should stay home with the baby. They didn't know John could change a diaper as well as I could. After 4, you better be able to have some help. And so I lost. And so the village president called me and said, we'd like to appoint you to the Board of Appeals. Would you take that appointment? And I asked what it did and how often it met. So I'll have to call you back. So he calls me back. And then he asked, I ended up taking the appointment. And to this day can remember the statutory language that you have to follow as a Board of Appeals looking at zoning and what have you. You can either give a variance based on practical necessity or unnecessary hardship, statutory words. And I think I was the first one that ever asked it. So then I went in, then I was appointed to the Planning Commission. And in fact, when I was appointed to the Board of Appeals, I went into the village clerk. And that's where I got the statutory. I said, now what do we do on what basis? What empowers us to do what we're supposed to do? No one had ever asked him that before. And so he thought that was rather noteworthy. And then I asked to be placed, I just served 1 3-year term there, I believe it was, and then I asked to be appointed to the Planning Commission because there's a lot more action in terms of...
Well, how much action is there on the Board of Appeals?
Enough that you had meetings. You know, they're enough that people want to build something too close to the lot line, or they want to change the variance to use property for something different, even in a small community like Elm Grove. I mean, it's geographically at 9 miles square. That's a small community if you think 3 miles on side. And then the Planning Commission, again, you'd think Elm Grove was all built up. No, it wasn't. So there was a lot more activity. So then I served there, and I was serving there and had become quite involved there when I ran for, no, there was the fellow I almost beat had to resign because his business was transferring him. Oh. And so they appointed me. They had, and I was the first woman. They had the courage to appoint me to fill his vacancy a couple months before the election. And so I had a run with 6 people for 3 openings in the next election. And I came in second. So I won my spurs finally and was elected. That was in 76. 76.
You must have made some kind of impression if they appointed you.
I guess so. I guess so. Yes. And then after, in 76, it's 2-year terms for that. And I was reelected twice after that. I was in the beginning of that 3rd term when the president of the village, who had been there almost all that time, said he wasn't going to run again. Now, there's a pecking order in that kind of a community, so the next one up was the next tenured who wanted to be president, and people were asking me to run for village president. Now, I'm the first woman there. Now they're asking me to be the first woman. I never ran as a woman. I ran because I loved public policy, and people knew that. And so anyway, I said, no, I won't, because it's Jim's turn. And they said, oh, no, we really want you to do it. And I said, the only way I will consider running is if the present president asks me to. In other words, I've broken through the good old boys club, and he's going to ask me to. And so it happened. He called me and asked me to run. So I ran. And Jim decided not to run against me. He knew what a tiger I was. Well, but what happened was, no. And he ultimately became village president some years later. And but the fellow that ran against me had left the board. We came on the board together. He was an attorney, and he was in fact with one of the firms in municipal law, and he was doing the open meetings, public documents. I said that right, yeah. I always have to make sure where I put the adjective. Open meetings, public documents law was being put into existence at that moment in time. So he gave our board a great briefing because he was one of the attorneys doing it around the area for the municipalities. So I learned that law and those statutes at his, teaching. And anyway, he came back then after he left for one period. He came back to run for village president. His family, his dad had coached every child in Elm Grove, I think. It was kind of like running against the Kennedys in Massachusetts, running against this fella, a great fella. So we ran against each other, and I beat him 2-1, and the rest was history.
And we were up to 1981?
So now we're up to 1981, and yes, exactly. Boy, are you good. You're tracking that well.
So you've been on the village board for
11 years in all. 11 years in service.
And then village president. Can you tell a little bit about what duties are involved in these offices?
Well, the village president, if you look in the statutes, only has to keep the peace. I had a lot of fun with that. Well, we had a little bit of problem. No, before that was while the other village president was there. We unearthed some Indian bones in one of our developments, right along the river bottom area in the village, behind this convent.
Okay. There are all kinds of statutes about that now. I don't know if there were then.
Well, there probably weren't, but a dog kept bringing bones home to a house in the neighboring subdivision. They discovered they were human bones, and then they discovered they were coming out of the earth in this subdivision where the sewers and the roadways were being prepared. And so we quickly cordoned it all off, and then several tribes found out about it, and we had a medicine man there 24 hours a day at the site. And we had collected we called the archaeologist from UWM. There was a baby, and he put that in a plaster cast so none of the bones would be lost and it could be opened up later. And then they collected all the human bones, and they had a male human laid out on our conference table that was taller than history was saying the tribal people were at that time. He also had an arrowhead in the base of his skull, which ran against the known knowledge or the tradition that there were no warring tribes at that time. This was the time of the Red Ochre period, right before Christ. This is what these went back to. And I mean, it was significant. And so we had, the village president, other than I was on the board at this time, only woman, they decided to take it under advisement, and then ultimately had a hearing at which anyone from the tribal side of the issue could come and be heard. We had a meeting right before that saying, well, what we would like to do is come out of this discussion and give the bones to the archaeologist for like 6 weeks, I think it was, for his ability to get us some written tradition knowledge of this, because up to this point there's no written, their tradition is all oral in the tribal history. And so this is to the benefit of everyone in this area to understand what our history is and what the tradition is. And so that was going to be the motion. We walked out into our meeting room, and every headdress you've ever seen was sitting on someone's head. It was a tribal show of colors that was overwhelming. The whole room was filled with tribal people wanting and getting the respect they should have for their history, dressed accordingly. And so we go out. Guess who they've asked to make that motion, to give my colleagues, to give this information, to make the motion to give this to the archaeologist for 6 weeks. Margaret, you can do that. At that time I was Peg yet. Peg, you can do that. Oh yeah, sure guys. And why aren't any of you willing to? So anyway, we had the hearing, and it was very, very dramatic. It was very sincere, and it lasted a long time. And at the end of it, we respectfully said, this is what we'd like to do for the benefit of all our cultures, and then we will have a discussion at the end of 6 weeks, and with you as to how you want these bones to be properly respected and permanently interred. Well, so I made the motion, and that's what we did, and they were very unhappy because they wanted the bones immediately. But yet, it was there was no single voice. And unfortunately at the time, Ada Deer, who was the head of, more or less, the spokeswoman for the Native.
She ran for Congress here later.
Yeah, she had to be out of the state at a funeral somewhere in, I want to say Oklahoma or somewhere at the time. She had told our village attorney that she couldn't be there, and could she somehow give us testimony anyway. She came the next month. It was not pretty because our village president wasn't up on what was going to happen, and it was very bad. I ached because I would love to have been with the gavel at that time. It would have been handled a little differently, I think, but that's hindsight. Anyway, we got through it. She accepted it. Ultimately, the decision was made, and the next thing we know, I go up north with my children. Before I got home that night, I had threatening phone calls. And we went up north, and to make a long story short, AIM, the American Indian Movement, threatened to surround the village. And we were told by the Justice Department, we're not going to come and protect you. So we ended up having to have a judge make the decision. And the bones were given to the tribal people.
About what year was that? This before you were president then?
Oh yeah, this was probably 78, 9. I would say I could probably work longer, but you don't want me to get it right down exactly. It was summer, and so we were going to, as I say, go up north. And I was worried. I was leaving my oldest son home, and I was really worried about him being home alone, quite frankly. It was a very uncomfortable feeling. And, but it gave me a great respect for the singular voices of each tribe. You know, it's very hard to get a consensus of our 11 tribes in this state. I learned it firsthand because they each are very much their own tribal thinking and their own tribal tradition. And so I learned an awful lot through it, and which, you know, I've carried the rest of my life. And so there's been some very interesting things. But all this time, I'm getting a rumbling of, why don't you run for the legislature? Well, I got into the sewer wars as village president. I don't know if you've ever heard of the sewer wars.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because when I went over your career as a legislator, you introduced some interesting bills about MMSD, and I thought I would ask you about that.
When I came out here, I became known as the sewer queen by my colleagues because if anybody had a question about sewers, I knew those statutes.
Well, describe the issue.
Well, what the issue was is with the Clean Water Act in the country, Chicago challenged Milwaukee that they were dumping sewage into the lake from our great big mammoth Jones Island sewage plant. And they said, you're polluting our Lake Michigan water, which is our drinking water. Well, it was also our drinking water in Milwaukee. And so they took them to federal court, and Milwaukee didn't think it was serious, and they lost. And so they had to go to the Court of Appeals and try to win it, you know, to overturn it. So then they got serious about it. And in fact, a young man from Elm Grove became their attorney, who was a municipal attorney for the sewage district. And what happened was the federal courts then dictated to them that they could not overflow. Then they negotiated that they could overflow several times a year, and that they had to start doing something about cleaning the waterways. And that's when the Deep Tunnel Project was started. There were two ways to do it. Milwaukee had more combined sewers than any other major city in the country. They could either separate all their combined sewers. By that I mean the storm water and the sewer water ran through the same sewer and got to the sewage plant to be treated. There were 22 square miles of that. There were some separated sewer areas in the city and in the county outside of Milwaukee, but there are 22 square miles of combined sewers in Milwaukee. And they were just, you know, pouring a boatload of water there. So the idea was all the other ones would be continue to be separated, maintained. If not separated, they would be. Many were having to separate because Milwaukee decided that was the way to go. The sewage district represents Milwaukee County and has a relationship with 9 communities around it.
Outside of the county?
Outside. They're called extraterritorial members.
Okay. And that included Elm Grove at that time?
That included several of New Berlin, Elm Grove, Brookfield, Mequon, Ozaukee, up in Ozaukee County, Germantown, Menominee Falls. There's 9. I'm not going to get to the 9. But so they contracted with the sewage district to take their sewage. Interestingly, the first linkage of sewers was Elm Grove in 1939. We had one of the first major municipal, that kind of, you know, that would make it 38 communities at that time, sewage being treated in one place in the country. It was quite unique at the time. It was an anaerobic plant that used bacteria to eat up. I mean, I have an engineer who gave me another whole education on that I shouldn't know about with my degree.
Elm Grove was already sending its sewage then in 1939 to Milwaukee.
Right, and always had. And I mean, had up from that point forward. So anyway, the 9 communities, what happened was they were saying the 9 communities should pay on a basis of property value, not on our flow. And this is for the improvements. Federal law says you have to pay based on flow for the operation and maintenance of any plant in the country. So in other words, as much as you put in, that's your prorated amount toward their operation and maintenance. But then when the Clean Water Act required all these plants to improve and do a lot of new construction, which is what Milwaukee was caught in, they originally passed a federal law that said it's also based on flow, and a number of wet industries and said, oh, that's not fair. So they redid the law and said it can be determined by each community. Most of them went to flow. In Milwaukee instead went to the property value. And since the higher the property value communities putting in probably less flow because they weren't industrial, they were paying the boatload of the money and were not being treated fairly.
Do these communities then or now have a representation on the board?
Nope.
Nothing?
No. They have, the Milwaukee suburbs get a vote but not the 9 out.
So they are nominated or by the mayor of Milwaukee?
The mayor appoints, and I'm not going to remember now. I think there's 9, 7 or 9, and the mayor has to appoints the majority of them. The Intergovernmental Cooperation Council, which is Milwaukee County, gets to appoint 1, and it's an elected official. The original plan was that they should be some elected officials appointed, and Henry Meyer, the first mayor working under that, ignored it. And he put ward committeemen. He said they were elected ward committeemen by their party ward leader, so he had them filling that. It was a job with benefits, $10,000 a year with benefits. John Norquist, to his credit, when he got in, put in elected officials, such as Brian Burke, Shirley Krug, a number of legislators from out here, Mordecai Lee, and so they were wearing like 2 hats. And anyway, so it became very heated. It was very expensive to battle it. They dug the deep tunnels to store the storm overflow. It's very much more complicated than that because the suburban areas cannot overflow at all. And the Milwaukee can overflow, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 times a year now, and that's kind of gone by the board. It's more than that. So if there's a big storm coming, they will open the deep tunnels, supposedly, to the suburbs by law, and the city has to overflow into the lake because the suburbs can't overflow. It's very, very, we asked them, how are you going to clean it out, these huge deep tunnels? And they, we'll clean it out. Well, now they're having trouble cleaning it out, literally lowering huge, what am I trying to, like a Caterpillar tractor down into it, a bulldozer to collect the debris and everything that collects in these, that takes away. They're huge. I rode down in a bucket, 380 feet down.
You went down there?
I went down into the North Tunnel when it was being built, but I only would do it if the head of the sewage district was in the same bucket with me. I figured they'd drop me, but they wouldn't drop him. And so I had in that Barrett, in that bucket, it was Pat Marchese, head of the sewage district, Tom Barrett, now mayor, who was in the legislature at the time, and then I can't remember who the one. I have a picture of us, and it was one other legislator. And so we rode down, and we rode the little train that went up to the big grinding wheel, a huge diameter. This is a huge, huge thing. And the DNR and the EPA said, or I think the DNR, you have to seal it because they thought it was solid limestone. It wasn't. It was very leaky limestone they were going through when they got down there. And we went by one geyser that was, well, about the diameter of this wall. So say 8 feet to 10 feet in diameter, leaking a hole that had been created. 2 weeks after I was down there, they had to close that tunnel because that let go with a geyser of water, and it flooded the tunnel. And they had to repair everything before they could go down and continue drilling. I mean, it's a real, and this downtown, the city of Milwaukee is a swamp underneath everything. It was built, a number of rivers come in there, and so all of the major buildings, including the beautiful old Milwaukee Auditorium, which is now the Milwaukee Theater Center, they all had a lot of wooden pilings under them, sitting in water, because of the moisture in the ground. Well, you've got leaking tunnels now that are taking all that groundwater into them.
Dries those pilings out. Yeah.
And guess what happened to the buildings? At one point, the northwest corner of that Milwaukee Theater Center was hanging because nothing was underneath it. So when they began the renovation of it, they had to begin by shoring up the building. A number of buildings have been taken down in Milwaukee because they got all out of square, let's say. So yeah, it's been an interesting story, and it isn't solved. They didn't do it the right way, by digging these deep tunnels and letting the 22 miles of square miles of combined sewers continue to exist. They're continuing the problem.
And this impelled you into the legislature by representing your community?
Well, what happened was I was out here as chairing FLOW, the Fair Liquidation of Waste. That was
FLOW. You had mentioned FLOW before, and I remember the FLOW communities they used to call them.
Right, and so I was out here lobbying on behalf of FLOW as a local official. We had a lobbyist, we had to pay that lobbyist. I didn't have
Who were you
to
lobbying exactly? The sewerage district?
The legislature did not end us with legislation that would annihilate our right to be dealt with, and they tried. In 1983, they tried in that budget language, and at the time, Senator Lynn Edelman was representing New Berlin, so he was our ally because he had to represent his community. And so we had to hold off legislation that they were trying to do to us and then try to maybe get some. First time I met Governor Thompson, he was minority leader. I walked into his office with our attorney, and at that point I was still pegged because I hadn't put Margaret Farrow on a ballot, and people began to see my yard signs as Margaret Farrow, you know, candidate for assembly. So he got to know me originally as Peg. So I was out here. I knew, you know, they'll tell a candidate, a serious candidate, for local office, go sit in some of the meetings of the body you want to join so you understand. I came in here knowing exactly what went on around through the year. I had a great, you know, whatever. And so people were talking me into running. Well, when our youngest was 15, I decided I was a little frustrated, so I ran against a 6-year incumbent on my side of the aisle.
John Young.
Yes, yes. Oh, you did your homework
I
well.
looked that up, yeah.
Yes.
And why did you run against him in particular? Or just, I mean, that was your district, but was there something that he was lacking in the sewerage issue? Or
Understanding it.
Understanding.
Yeah, there's a lot of explanation given, and there wasn't quite I mean, yeah, he had been a Brookfield alderman, so he understood local government, and but he just didn't get the message, and we needed someone to make a little more noise in a very comfortable Republican district, and so I ran. He had always been challenged in the primary, and the other two challenges or three challenges were young male attorneys on our side of the aisle.
Were they also interested in your issue, or is
no,
it other things?
They just wanted the chance. And so I ran, and he had always beat them with Elm Grove helping him, his Brookfield part in Elm Grove. Well, he wasn't going to count on Elm Grove this time because I did get a marvelous support and a number of votes in Brookfield, so I beat him. Close, it was a very close election. In fact, I had to wait a bit to see if he was going to ask for a recount, and he didn't. What
was your campaign like? This is a larger constituency than you've ever run in before.
Well, I guess listening to people, to the constituents, making sure that I knew what our communities needed and that I was available, which I had always been in local government, and just kind of.
Any professional help? Any help from the party? I suppose the party
didn't
have anything to do with it.
They didn't want, you know, I remember when you know how they have the parade of candidates in June or wherever it is, so I was out here and I had been here as a local government person watching this parade of candidates the year before, or the year before that. And so I knew what was going on. So I came to it, and I'm over at the concourse, and I'm standing there watching all the Republican candidates be introduced as a Republican candidate who would not be introduced. And so Governor Thompson, then Representative Thompson, comes up alongside of me and says, "Why aren't you up there?" I said, "Because they won't acknowledge that I'm running." And he said, "That isn't right." And I said, you know, and he was very close friends with John Young. I said, "Oh, come on, you know, don't pull one on me. I know the way this works." So anyway, that was kind of a funny side of it. And so on election night, I beat John. And
did you expect to win?
Yeah. I wouldn't go into a race if I didn't think. I wouldn't say I walked through it being sure, but if I hadn't thought I had a chance and didn't want to do something and have a reason for running, I wouldn't have run. And it was close. And then, of course, I had a nominal Democrat opponent, but in our district that didn't count, and that didn't matter. And then it wasn't. And then I had 5 elections in 3 years in one period of my life, because then I ran again in 2 years, and then I had already just the year before run for re-election as village president. So now I'm up to 2 in 1 year, and then I went 2 years later. But then when Susan Engleiter was appointed by the first George Bush, 41. To the Small Business Administration after she lost to Herb Kohl. Then it was a matter, that was the all-Republican, all-woman district.
Right.
Susan, Lita Schneiders, Peggy Rosenzweig, and I ran against, I immediately was going to run. And
as soon as Engleiter was out, you were...
as soon as the rumor was out there, I was at Bush's inaugural. Tommy had a huge group out. We were at I mean, he organized it, and so we were all together at the one of the hotels in Georgetown.
This
for
is
the
January of
inaugural.
'89 then.
Right. And so he and I had just been sworn in to my second term as assembly rep, you know, the first Tuesday of January, and this is later in that month, and so had Peggy. She was one term ahead of me, and she got there by beating an incumbent Republican, George Klicka, and Jerry Klicka, and 2 years before I did. And so anyway, I let it be known that I was going to run, and the rumor was Peggy wasn't at the event, but there were the people there talking on her behalf. So the battle was joined and couldn't be joined officially until Susan could resign when George Bush officially appointed her after her security clearances were complete. So it was actually the primary for our race was the day after Memorial Day. Now you try to convince people that the Tuesday after Memorial Day is an election day. They think it's a Monday, they don't think it's a Tuesday, and there's never an election in May. And so it was a matter of getting the vote out, and we did with in a pouring rainstorm with rain slickers on. I had people at the exits of the expressway waving signs, "Vote Farrow today." And we had many people tell us that caused them to go right off the expressway to the polling place, or they would have forgotten it. So we fought hard, and I won decisively.
It was not that close. Huh?
Nope. And then I gave up 2/3 of my district several years later in redistricting in '90 to be able to, you know, make sure we could have Republican votes around, and that's how Peggy and Alberta Darling got safer seats to run in.
Okay.
And then I had a brand new district to run in the next time, basically 35% old district. A lot of it in Milwaukee County, a lot of it in the city of Milwaukee on the south side that everybody thinks is West Dallas. But I won.
And now you'd been in the Assembly
3 years I was in the
term
Assembly.
and change.
Yeah. 16 months, 18 months, 17 months, about that, because
You served
I
one
left
full
in
term.
May, one full term, and then January to May.
Okay.
My son Paul has beat me. He didn't finish his first term when he made the switch. When Rich Zipper
That's right.
went to the governor's office, Paul, in the December of his second year in the Assembly, was elected to the Senate. So we kidded that he beat me by 5 months.
Was there much difference in serving in the Assembly versus the Senate?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What are the differences?
Well, fewer people to deal with, you know, fewer colleagues, more complexities to the positions people have to take because of the mix of their districts. You know, you can have a half and half district when you have 3 assembly districts together. You can be very easily, you can decide things very easily in the Assembly for the most part, because the majorities are a little clearer in your seat. I mean, you can as a representative, but you get into a Senate district that's, you know, not 2/3 one party, 1/3 the other, or as I say, half and half. There are a few that are pretty solid, and it's more of a debating society than I'm not quite sure how to characterize what goes on in the Assembly. I was not good in the Assembly because I couldn't get up and harangue. I'm not a haranguer. I'm not a bomb thrower.
That's what you'd characterize it as?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, there are some very articulate members over the years who have given wonderful floor speeches. And yet some of David Prosser, for example, as Speaker, some of his best stuff that people remember was when he flipped the switch and went ballistic at the, you know, at the opposition side of whatever issue was going. And I meant to the issue, not necessarily to anyone personally.
Do you attribute that to the number of members or to the size of the district?
The number of members and just the hall. It's a bigger hall, even though they're all amplified. You just feel as though to get everyone's attention, you have to do something. I got up and announced that my mother died, and nobody even heard me. You know how you get up and you adjourn in honor of the wonderful this or that. Nobody even heard me, and no one ever said to me, "I'm sorry, your mother died." They didn't hear me because I was too studied the way I said it. I was too polite in the way I said it. And so I get into the Senate where we had some marvelous orators. I mean, Mike Ellis could get up with no preparation and outspeak anyone in the body, and do it holding everyone's rapt attention, if not right there in their offices or wherever they were listening. It's a much different, it is a different body, more difficult in a way to deal with and to work issues through. That's the way our bicameral legislative process should be. Things shouldn't fly through. Things shouldn't be easy. Things should be very carefully examined and worked over and listened. There should be a good time to listen to the people that we're acting on behalf of. So I guess I loved it. I found it very, the classic issue, of course, during my era was the Miller Park Stadium. And I was assistant majority leader sitting next to Ellis through that long night.
Maybe you can shed some light on that as long as you bring it up. My recollection is there were three. The final question was voted on 3 separate times in the middle of the night. 4.
It was the 4th one that it finally carried on. Yeah.
And
yeah, it didn't pass. We were 1 vote short.
It was reconsidered multiple times.
Yes, yes. And Mayor Norquist had promised Governor Thompson that he would produce 6 city votes for it because he wanted it to happen, and that was the agreement. So Governor Thompson had passed that on to Mike Ellis, who kept saying, all right, I know I'm counting heads in my caucus, and Mike was opposed to it and did not vote for it.
That was one of the things, is the majority leader himself voted no.
Right. Even
while
though
he shepherds this vote
even though he
through.
knows more baseball memorabilia than anyone in that building, he and Bud Selig got into it. I was in the room when they did it and went on a memory challenge for each other, and he memorabilia'd Bud Selig. I mean, he loves baseball, but he did not want to see that public, whatever. And there was never a discussion at that point of a referendum. And which, anything that happens from now on, there would have to be a referendum. You won't, like this arena discussion now in downtown Milwaukee. Unless they're going to build it themselves, there will be a referendum before anyone will, I would predict. Anyway, so we started on the vote, and it failed 3 times. There was not 1 city vote for it. I'm meaning city legislator, not 1.
And you say that the mayor of Milwaukee said there would be 6 city votes in the Senate.
Yes, that he would deliver 6 votes, and meaning some others that he'd persuade from the other side of the aisle, and from his side of the aisle. And so the whole time George Petak was playing with the idea that he was going to switch his vote. Now, George had told the people at Racine he would not vote for a tax on Racine. As we all know, the rest is history. And between the third and fourth vote, Norquist came on the floor and was talking for a long time with Gary George. And when he had to leave, when Ellis came back on the floor and we were going to reconvene, Ellis was going to message the bill to the Assembly without passing.
Okay.
Now, I think he believed, there's a part of me that believes that we would have continued to deal with it and something would have been agreed to by both houses, ultimately. I was told by someone behind me, and you know how it's laid out and how the staff is behind.
Sure.
I was called and said, the vote is there, it's George. Now, wouldn't you think it was Gary George?
George T. Petak or Gary George?
Well, see, I didn't stop to ask. That was my mistake. So I grabbed Mike Ellis and say, they say they have the votes, and I think it's Gary George, because he was all along the one that was supposedly going to do it. So we were waiting for him to make his dramatic switch.
This is at like 2 or 3 in the morning, as I remember.
Yeah, at least 2:30 or so, yeah. But I'm a night person, so I was still, I never had a problem with late nights. Anyway, so with that, the roll call started. And as you know, in the Senate, you have to sit in your seat, and you have to be recorded in your seat. You stay in your seat when you're finished. So we start going through the roll call, and we get to Gary George, and he votes no. So the rest is history. It passed with George Petak's, changing his vote. Mike Ellis, and this is how history changes. Mike Ellis went back in his office. We all went in. Gary and George Petak was there, and he said, well, at least you're not up for 2 years, and you'll recover it with your people. No one thought of a recall because it hadn't been done.
Right.
And I think Chuck Qualla had it all warmed up by then. That was all, it played right into his hands. And that's, the rest is history. But that issue I liken to the abortion issue. And the reason I say that is issues like the abortion issue and Miller, and as it turned out, Miller Park, people had the amount of information they wanted. It was quite emotional, and you weren't going to budge them. They were totally locked into it, cemented feet in that position. I was sitting in the parking lot of a coffee shop in my district in Elm Grove, right up the street from my house. And I was waiting to meet someone. It was middle of the afternoon, nobody there, 2 cars in the parking lot. I saw the person's car wasn't there, so I stayed working in my car. All of a sudden, someone's hammering on my window, and it's 2 more than middle-aged women. I roll my window down. You're Senator Farrow. Yes, I'm Senator Farrow. We want you to know that if you vote for that stadium, we'll never vote for you again. And just laced me up one side and down the other. And I listened politely, and I said, well, I'm going to see what is before us and what it consists of when it comes, and I appreciate hearing from you. Now, I could have sat there and had 2 more people walk up to me, do the same thing, and say, if you don't vote for that stadium, I will never vote for you again. It was, I couldn't convince, and I couldn't have convinced either side of the benefit of the other side of the position because they didn't want to hear it. They were blind to it. It was emotional, and it was a gut issue. Now, the same is true of abortion. You either believe that it's wrong or you believe that it's right. You believe one way or the other, and you're not going to move people. Very few people have changed their position on abortion. And so I just found it, to this day, very interesting. There's complexities to the Miller Park that I think people didn't completely understand. I am proud as can be that I voted for it. And I mean, this latest little, somebody finally, after all these years, did the research and how much does it cost somebody? $27 a year. You know, that isn't very much when you think of what it does for our state, much less that corner of the state. And I'm very proud of it. So I don't mean that to thumb the noses, my nose in all the constituents who disagreed with me on it, but I think it's something we had to do, and I think it's a bargain price. Where did we make a mistake? We made a mistake by not saying, if the ownership of this ballpark changes, of this ball team changes, the profits have to be used first to pay off the debt, and then the rest goes in the pocket of the owner.
Do you
we
think
didn't do that.
Mr. Seelig and his family would have gone for that?
What could they have said if it was in the state law, since they didn't put that much of their own money up, if any, up for it at all? I mean, I have to admire Bud Siegel. He loves baseball, and he's retiring on the top of his game as commissioner. But he, I have to be careful. I disagree with the way he made an awful lot of money on the sale of that club, and we're still paying off the rest of that debt.
Okay. You were a teacher, and you always demonstrated some interest in educational issues when you were in the legislature. What were you trying to accomplish in the area of education? What are your feelings on that issue? I
wanted to make sure every child in this state received a good education, whether they were college-bound or they were career-bound through one of the trades, the skilled trades or the trades, or they were going to just be able to support themselves with whatever employment they took. I wanted to make sure we were preparing every one of them for that, and I still feel that way. And we did some really interesting things with a group of us on our own, those of us, it was, how would you say, it was a planning session that went to Germany back in the late 90s looking at the Jugendorfs, and we all paid our own way.
What's a Jugendorf?
A Jugendorf is a youth village. It was begun by the worldwide YMCA after World War II. And we're sitting in this castle, literally a castle, for dinner the first evening we were there, only to find out from the gentleman who owned the castle and who was very involved in the worldwide Jugendorf movement that it was initiated and first supported by the Grady Foundry family in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
And you know, it was like, oh my goodness, here we are that far. And we had Sue Ann Thompson, Jim Clauser, educators from the various universities and tech schools. We had people from here, DPI, sure, the father-in-law of our past senator. Why am I forgetting his name? I didn't mean to, my former colleague in the state Senate. Tell me who Ron Johnson beat.
Ron Johnson.
Who was the U.S. Senator, is it? Feingold.
Feingold, of course.
But I mean, it's awful when you know someone that well and you can't remember the name. Anyway, and I've never remembered names. It's not a matter of age. But anyway, so his father-in-law, who was at DPI, was there. A whole bunch of, in a lot of community groups. So what we were looking at in Germany is, what do we do with the somewhat at-risk young person in our state who haven't been adjudicated yet but aren't going to succeed if they keep going down the path they're on. In Germany, these Jugendorf started after World War II, and they began because there were no longer fathers and uncles to take the young men into the trades, into the skilled trades and what have you. So they had to find a way to get them in there. So these were residential schools put together by companies that needed the employees, the chambers of commerce, which are very different in their role in Germany, and the parents. The schools, the parents, the chambers, everyone had to agree to have these young people go to these youth villages. And it was a kind of a combination of school and outward bound, you know, learning as much as you can about your own abilities. And they characterized it as the three-legged stool. They had paraprofessionals who were the counselors that lived with the young boys and had all sorts of other activities for them on weekends and in the evening. Their binders were as thick as the academic one. And then they had the academic component, and then they had the employment component, where they were literally learning skills in the whatever factory that was supporting it. Exactly. And we visited 5 of them, and it was fascinating. We came back and really worked for some time trying to get one started in this state. It never made it. There's a whole bunch of reasons why. Accrediting the teachers were one of the reasons. Now with the charter school and choice school voucher program, it would be more easily done. And there's some variations of that, but not residential.
Do you think it's an idea that could still be pursued?
Oh, yeah, I do. And one of the reasons, the residential settings were almost all out of the cities. They were in more pastoral settings. This is in central Germany for the most part. And we headed down toward Munich finally toward the end. And the reason I think it could happen here is they found that by removing the boys from, and it would be both men and boys, young women and men, I mean, now, if they take them out of the neighborhoods that weren't making it for them there and get them into a different setting, it worked. They could go back on weekends to their homes, but a lot of them wanted to stay with this outward bound activities. They'd do camping trips and do all sorts of other things to learn more skills and more things about themselves and develop courage and everything. It was fascinating.
So you think the residential aspect was important?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we met the boys in their residential setting and all. It was very, and the group stayed together. We kept working at it for some time and tried very hard to get it started, and it was a matter of funding and a matter of regulations getting in the way.
Remember about what year that was?
At the end of the 90s, it was, I'd have to look at my reports. I'm trying to think who was on my staff working with me at the time. That helps me, but it was in the late 90s.
Okay.
And it was fascinating, but that was, I still loved to be a teacher. And I loved the fact that they were reaching kids in a very unique, special way. I visited the residential school that's in Washington, D.C. on my own after that, several years after that.
Is that on a similar model?
Somewhat. It's a for-profit school. They tried to start one here in Wisconsin and again had too many problems with the regulations and what have you, which is really too bad. And I think that can be overcome now. I think we could do it. But they found, again, the kids came for the week, went home on weekends. And they were having great success with it. But that was a choice school in Washington, D.C. has had trouble supporting it since the president stopped the choice funding for Washington, D.C. So it's been an interesting thing, but I think we have to find alternatives. I don't think our present system can be the answer for everyone, and that's why I have been a school choice supporter. Not to say let's do away with public schools, but to find the best way to reach these kids and have education presented and hopefully learn something by narrowing down the amount of overhead administrative stuff that has to be done by these schools, proving they can get the job done without that much overhead requirement, and maybe be able to get our public schools to be a little lighter on that side, so the teachers can actually do more teaching and not just filling out paper forms and what have you.
Economic development's another issue. I see your name come up on. What are your thoughts on that? What should we be doing, especially for the southeastern region where you're from?
Well, I guess I learned at my dad's knees that he gave me my business degree, even though I had my political science degree.
Your dad worked for Snap-on Tools.
Yeah,
what did he do there?
He was the financial guy.
Okay.
He started as a bookkeeper and retired as their VP of finance. He was a self-made guy, no college, taught himself high school math, and took his bookkeeping courses at Northwestern University. He qualified and got in there for bookkeeping. The rest he learned. He was a very bright guy, and both my parents were. One was very German with German immigrant parents, and my mother was very Irish with Irish immigrant parents. And she was what would be now an administrative assistant to 2 different presidents in Chicago. They both stopped their formal education at 8th grade by necessity, and Mom went to a stenographer school for secretaries and came out and got jobs at 14 in the Loop in Chicago. So I'm kind of proud of my roots, and she was a very stubborn Irishman and neat woman, and my dad was a marvelous human being and very liked by his co-workers at Snap-on. But he taught me that, and kept driving in my head, that if there isn't money being made, there's no way government will have anything to spend to help people, that it's the private sector that's the engine of the economy. And you have to justify spending in the private sector, and felt that you should in the public sector. So I came in with that very conservative attitude. And my sense is the better and the more successful we can make the private sector, the more that will give government the ability to have funds to do with what we feel it really should be done on behalf of the citizens.
What policies did you pursue in the legislature to facilitate that?
Oh my God, that's like asking which kids did what when. I guess I didn't do as much. I wanted regulations eased if they weren't justified, if they were just somebody's good idea sitting with their feet under a desk and didn't know how the real world, really operated. I don't think
similar to what you said about your husband, the engineers had never worked.
Exactly. Yeah, that didn't understand, that just had all the book learning. So I guess there was some of that. I did a lot more because as I was out here longer and longer, I realized that we were doing a lot to create our own problems for ourselves as state government. And so I authored the bill that ended up creating the SAVE Commission back in the late 90s also. And we had 4, 1 seated, and that was Jim Clauser, and 3 former Department of Administration secretaries on that commission, plus a bunch of other people who brought an awful lot to it. And we gave a report that to this day you could take off the shelf and say, why don't we start trying some of this stuff?
I was going to ask you about SAVE. I mean, there are a lot of things in there. Do you think that was ever implemented?
Well, one of the reasons, no, it wasn't implemented, to Tommy Thompson's chagrin, because I talked him into signing it. I talked him into appointing the committee.
It seemed like you were after something like this for a while before it actually happened.
You've really done some homework. I'm surprised. Good for you. But anyway, the point that the problem that developed, and that was in 90.
SAVE was in 95, I think. 94?
Yeah, 95. Yes, and right before that, Tommy, if you remember, Tommy Thompson always said, "I want to pay half of the school bill with state funds, so our local school districts are somewhat get a burden lifted a bit, so that they're not funding as much and as much and as much. We'll pay more and more out of the state coffers." Well, the cost of schools kept moving away from him. I mean, it kept increasing, so that 50% kept growing. Well, in 93, we put a cap on that. And that was the first year the Republicans were in control.
The levy limit?
At the Senate. Yes, and this was Mike Ellis again and a bunch of us working together, and Tommy, you know, in collaboration with Tommy. And at that time, the assembly was still Democrat, and Wally Kunicki was the leader over there. It wasn't until another legislative election that
95,
yeah,
the Republicans
that they
took the
won.
assembly.
And so we're now in first time in more than 20 years the Senate is Republican, and over 22 years the assembly is still Democratic. And so at that point, we did get the cap through. You ask me how? I don't know. Tommy did amazing things, and we did working with the Democratic Assembly when people worked together and when people talked together. And Tommy, I mean, nobody remembers Tommy, his very first budget in '87, cut the income tax rate in half. It had been 13 point something, 5 or 7 top, 7.5 bottom. He cut those in half. And to this day, except for the top level of the top one that Jim Doyle raised in his last budget, they're still at that half of what they were in '87, and people forget that. And he did that with a Democratic legislature, both houses, entrenched, powerful, in the big offices, with the wooden desks, with the good typewriters, and we had all the metal stuff on the Republican side of the aisle. I mean, there was a real ranking, you know, and privilege because they had been in control for so long. But even out in that atmosphere, we made things work together. And so anyway, now we're up to '94. We put the cap on spending, the levy limits on schools, how much they could increase every year. So the next year, Michigan put in a bill that said the state will pick up 2/3 of the funding of schools. Wally Kunicki got up on the assembly floor, still in control, and said, that's a good idea. I think we ought to do that here. The press ran to the East Wing and said to the governor, or ran into him somewhere and found him and said, what do you think of Wally Kunicki's idea of the 2/3? Because the governor had always wanted.
This is in '93 yet, when they're the majority?
Now.
So he's still in the speaker.
Yeah,
he's still speaker.
He's still speaker, yes. And so, so they put the mic up to the governor and say, what do you think of this 2/3 majority? And Tommy says, well, if it gets to my desk, I'll look at it, which was kind of his typical answer to anything when you'd ask him, but they took that as a open-minded maybe. So we're put on the spot. What's the Senate going to do? And so the whole thing had to happen as it all played out. So 2/3 funding of the schools of the state could be done because the cap had been put on them the year before, so the budgets wouldn't keep running away from, you know, the amount. I walked into the governor's office after all this finally kind of fell in place, and he said, you took all my money for my SAVE Commission incentives. And that's what happened.
That is what happened.
The 2/3 that went to the schools, the greater amount that went to the schools to make the 2/3, took the, however you want to approximate, a couple million or whatever, to put incentive money out to have people encouraged to try some of the cost-saving things that are in the SAVE Commission report that are still timely today. They still could be done today. And so that's the frustration, because I mean, Governor Lucey needed that. You needed some incentives or people wouldn't do it. When he tried to consolidate the number of school districts way back when, he put incentives in that there'd be a cost saving to those school districts that did that for a number of years. The state would help them with their tax burden by them showing good faith in collapsing into a larger district to save overhead costs and what have you. And you know, not enough jumped in to make him a completely happy camper, as I understand it, but Governor Lucey at least got us down to the 426 we are now from the larger number. And many of those still have barely 250 students in their districts, with all the needed mandated positions to fill and everything to serve those 250 as our larger districts have to have.
So the SAVE ideas are still valid.
Absolutely.
They just need some kind of incentive for the various units of government, local and state, to jump on.
Well, and it was mostly state government, because the SAVE Commission, the acronym is the Study of Administrative Value and Efficiency for State Government. And it was how we are asking the state. And of course, I keep reminding everybody, it's just barely a quarter of the budget of the state that actually funds state operations. People often are sure.
Your interest in this is born from what? Your longtime interest in government, governmental structure?
Yeah, I'm always asking why or why not. I guess so, and I still, when I left office, I helped form a group in Waukesha County that were the business people, bringing their problem solving and knowledge and expertise to public issues, similar to the original Greater Milwaukee Committee, and now it's merged with the county chamber, so it's now the Waukesha County Business Alliance, 900 members. We have a policy board and working in 4 different areas of public policy, and I'm proud as can be of it.
What are the prospects for the southeastern counties to work together, especially the Milwaukee-Waukesha divide they talk about?
Well, if there are 5, there generally are 5 or 7 counties.
Depends how you count them.
Exactly. And I would say if you took Milwaukee out of it, they'd work together just beautifully. If we get a mayor in Milwaukee who came from the suburbs, won credibility in Milwaukee, ran for office and became mayor, and didn't see the enemy all the way around his community, as every mayor has that I have known, we may have a chance to have open-mindedness. But the M7, which it sounds like a bank heist or something, they say it's an accident, it was called M7. I said, it's too serious a title to be an accident. And I have argued it every time, you know, and I was going as kind of a member of this group that I had helped form, the Weekend Group.
M7 is Economic Development Group.
It's the Milwaukee, well, you tell me what, it's the 7 counties in that part of the state's economic development.
I'm not even sure which counties they are.
Oh, well, it's the whole bit, Kenosha, Walworth, Racine,
Okay.
And then it switches over to Milwaukee, Ozaki, Washington. Am I up to 7? Yeah.
So it's the 4 northern ones, and then Racine, Kenosha, and Walworth.
Walworth,
Okay.
yes. And but when they begin to do business surveys to see what was needed, they'd have a map up on the wall at the quarterly meetings, and they'd have pins in the map for all the surveys they did of businesses, and they couldn't make them all fit in Milwaukee because they were all in Milwaukee or Milwaukee County. The rest of the counties hadn't even been contacted. I mean, it's blatantly pro-Milwaukee, and unfortunately, it could be doing better. It should be doing better. We have so many. We have the people, the educational institutions, the natural resources, port, rail, air. We've got it all, and we're finding that out in Kenosha County. My home county is just going crazy because Illinois is realizing there are better things across the state line now in terms of public policy, attitudes, regulations, and taxes.
So it's a matter of trust.
Yeah, and I mean, I have a handwritten letter that I'm saving from John Norquist because I chastised him as he left the Senate to become mayor of Milwaukee. I said, John, are you going to finally be the mayor that will work with the suburbs, all the suburbs? And he said, I am. I'll listen. And he even wrote me a letter to that effect, handwritten. And then within 6 months, the air in that office had taken over his thinking, and he was just
You
as
didn't
bad
think he
as-
followed through on that?
No. He and I used to have coffee across the street in the hotel, if anybody would have thought it. And this was like post-Flow, which made me the enemy of the city, supposedly. He and I got along just fine. And of course, then we had the shared support for school choice. So we had more in common than people would realize. And it's too bad because that should not exist. The Maginot line that is 124th Street, separating, as you started to say, between Waukesha and Milwaukee counties, it shouldn't exist the way it does. I don't believe the actual county government has that attitude. Chris Abley is a much more reasonable person to deal with in the other counties. It's the city.
I think it's the city
Milwaukee.
government.
It's the city
consistently
government.
through the years?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And it started with Henry Meyer in earnest, and unfortunately John carried it on, and now Tom is every bit as bad, if not worse, than John Norquist was in terms of that. You've got 17 communities in Milwaukee County. In Waukesha County alone, we have 37 communities. So you figure if you start thinking of all the combinations of things that you have to put together to make things work, I mean, people will say, Tom Barrett wanted us all to pay for a new arena. Well, what if the arena ended up out in one of the other counties, as it does in some of the areas?
Right.
In the New York area, Washington area, they're in Boston. They're not in the home city anymore. And, that wouldn't be allowed. I mean, that's just not going to be allowed.
Has somebody told you that specifically?
No,
Okay.
you're hearing my version.
You're-
I have a right to be. I'm calling myself
You're
a
anticipating
sage.
this reaction.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I have just too many decades of history of this to know how the attitude's going to be.
I wanted to ask you briefly about the Women's Council. You were on the Women's
Yes.
Council for many years. What were your experiences on that? Because it seemed like your appointment initially was not met with entire enthusiasm. But
well, the Women's Council is is started by Tony Earl, before Tommy, the 4 years before Tommy became governor, and it became initially, but even more in Tommy as Tommy Tommy kept it going, and it was just an appointment. It could have been ended, but Tommy kept it going. It was the debating society for the reproductive rights issues. That's basically what it was. They couldn't bring any of those issues to the floor of the legislature because they couldn't get them passed. So they weren't going to debate them and lose them there. So instead they debated them at the Women's Council. And they did it priming, or the press got the idea, if we want some good headlines, here's where we go. And if you remember, Tommy Thompson first put Mary Kohler on as chairman, and a lay person, by that I mean non-governmental person. And so she came in, and they just were running roughshod over Mary. They were bringing up agendas. They were making motions. They being the Democratic legislators who were part of the membership.
Was it 15 members, was it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
And a number of them were outside members from the general public, and then there were appointments of the legislative bodies. So the headlines were rampant, and every time it met, Tommy woke up in the morning and found screaming headlines at him about something related to the women's issues, mostly reproductive rights.
But it was mostly the abortion issue.
Yeah, it was mostly reproductive rights, whether it was contraception or abortion or whatever. It was there. That's where they brought them up and aired them comfortably because they had control. So now Tommy gets it. Mary Kohler's, that didn't last long. So then Tommy appointed Susan Vergeron, a state representative, as chair. And at that point, he put me on it. I didn't want to go on it.
You didn't
Women's
want to.
issues were not my issues. I did not run for women's issues. I ran, coming from my local government background, for good government, for good funding of our cities, for safe roads, for good schools, but I was not a woman to champion women. I felt my constituency was both men and women, and they all knew that. I spoke to that consistently going into the legislature.
And the governor must have known your position on that.
I think he did. And so anyway, so he put me on. I refused. He put me on again. He called me in his office again and said, that door's not going to open until you agree to go on the Women's Council. I said, all right, I'll go on. So I went on. Well, then Susan couldn't control it, and the headlines were continuing, just going crazy. So he calls me in his office again and says, I want you to chair this. Now, I'm the newest kid on the block at this point. This is my first term just about. And I said, I'm still in the assembly. And when I look back on it, I think, woo. So I told him no, and he really put his foot down and said, you've got to take it. I've got to have you in that chair. I said, all right, I'm only going to take it on one condition, and that condition is I'm going to change the agenda. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm going to change the addition to the woman in the workplace. Women getting education, women getting training, women getting medical benefits, and women getting child care. And that's the agenda of the new Women's Council. And he said, that's fine by me. So that's what I did. I went there, I let the body know what was going to be the future of the body, and lo and behold, who's now asking to be on it? But Chuck Qualla, Russ Feingold, and I can't remember the other two, but those two came armed to do battle, okay? But
they were Senate appointees.
Yes, and I'm again the new kid, okay? So but by then I've chaired enough meetings, so I'm not a neophyte. Going back, local government's great experience. You have better public meeting experience at the local level than you ever get out here because people scream at you at the local level, and you have to be ready to listen to everything and deal with everything reasonably. And so anyway, so I went through about 3 meetings with these guys, and they've got a stack of papers like this, and they're signing constituent, the kids' pictures and everything, and they're sitting there busying themselves through the whole meeting or leaving the meeting consistently and insulting all these women who came from all over the state to be at this meeting. Well, that got under the mother's, I every now and then play the role of the mother hen. And so about the 3rd or 4th meeting, at the end of the meeting, I said, I want to have some things understood here. And I looked right at the two of them. I mean, mind you, this is Chuck Wall and Russ Feingold I'm looking at. And I read them the riot act. And I said, they're insulting the other members by not being present at this. They asked to be on this council. That's how they got here. And if they can't spend the time at the meetings and be part of the discussions, then I think they should ask for new members from their caucus.
What was the reaction?
They were at all the meetings after that. So there's an interesting history for the length of that term, you know, for that period. And it was fine. And I have to give them credit. They shut up and they didn't do battle with me over it. And I think they had to because they wanted the respect of the women in the room, and maybe they legitimately didn't think of it. I don't know. But anyway, that's how it happened. So we had hearings out in the state. We had more happen than people will ever remember or want to remember because I was chairing it. I chaired it for close to 15 years. I don't know if you've got the dates there.
So I think it was 89 to 2000. Something like that.
I thought it was a little longer than that, but that's fine.
It could have been.
And anyway, but I was still on it when I was lieutenant governor.
Okay,
so
well
it
that
goes into that.
takes it farther.
And so anyway, we took hearings around the state, listening to women on all these issues. We had the women come to us from the Labor Council, their labor groups in Milwaukee, because the new ICE-T legislation at that time in Washington had mandated that a certain amount of money be taken out of the federal transportation dollars to train non-traditional workers in road construction jobs, and the women wanted themselves considered as non-traditional construction. And we worked, I mean, this was the neatest thing of all, besides the big trip that went to Germany. The other neat planning experience I had was I called a meeting as chair of the Women's Council, and it was held at what is now the CarMax site at Gerke's Corners in Milwaukee. There was a Holiday Inn there, and we had a table. They had a good-sized meeting, ballroom-type meeting room. We had a table that had at least 10 people on each side, a big square table that people were around. We had at least 40 people there from the industry of road building, from the unions, from the community groups in Milwaukee. You name it, they were there, from state government, from DOT. And we hammered out in that one meeting an agreement of what became known as, I'm not going to remember, and it's known. It's known nationally. I'd have to have looked at one of my wall plaques, but the Trans Project, that's what it was. And what it was, the community group screened the applicants. They agreed to be the safety net to get them to the workplace every day. If their car didn't break, or their ride wasn't there, or their car broke down, they had a safety net to call to get to the job. We had the road builders agreeing that all of their training, they footed the bill for. The unions screened and did their part. I mean, it was everybody saying, forget the old rules, we're going to work on this one together. And before the end of the first 3-month period, we had, I think, 30 candidates ready to go. And they wanted to get up on the machines. This is what the women said at the first meeting. We want to learn how to run those big machines. I would have agreed. I would have loved to have gotten up in them. But that's not how you start in the road building industry. You start with a shovel in your hand as a laborer. And so that's the steps they went through. When I am so proud of this program. It became a national model. And several of the DOT people have gone around the country talking about it at that time. I don't know where it is now. When the Assembly had to have the hearing on my appointment as Lieutenant Governor, it's the only time they ever have a vote on an appointment. And the 70-some, I think it was 74 legislation that made it.
State Assembly.
Yes.
Yes, it's their only consent power.
Their only consent power. So, and they didn't know what committee to put it in.
Yeah, they had never taken a vote like that before.
So the committee was the Judiciary Committee, and they had the hearing in Brookfield, in the municipal court in Brookfield. And the whole committee was there, and we had to scramble to get people to testify. My staff was unbelievable. I walked into the room in a timely way, maybe 10 minutes before it was going to start, and the mayor of Brookfield, Kate Bloomberg, is a riot. She was an image worth a novel, a nonfiction story though. And she walks up to me, and she knew me from the local government days, and she says, Peg, you're just going to have to figure this is your wake, and this is what people are going to say about you when you're dead. And she was right, because people testified to all that I had done that was so wonderful. And I'm going, I mean, I was surprised because I never think that I've done that much. The reason I even mention that is that we had two of the Democratic representatives, Pedro Colon and John from Sun Prairie. His brother's here now.
Hebel.
Thank you. And those
Tom.
two, yes, yeah. And John was the predecessor, right?
Tom and Gary are the brothers.
Okay, then it's all right. So the two of them, Pedro Colon and Tom, ripped me up one side and down the other. The committee started with their own comments and just said, I don't care for the working man, I have no concern. I mean, I thought, they got guts, because these are my friends, and this is a room full of my friends, apparently. And so anyway, this woman gets up there, a young woman in a union's blue satin jacket with the whole embroidery on the back, and goes through what I just told you, that if it hadn't been for what I did in the Women's Council in the project that we developed there, she would not have gone from a welfare mother to making $22 an hour. And I mean, my jaw dropped. I felt like, where did they find her? You know, I had a great chief of staff, and I was amazed. You know, it's so, yeah, the Women's Council did some interesting things, but not in the way it originally started at all. And it continues to this day, and I'm not sure what its function is, but we had some interest. The glass ceiling task force we did, and we had a glass ceiling commission continue after that, because Elizabeth Dole, then Secretary of Labor, came to us and said, you're the only statewide women's council, and we want some publicity to this survey we just found of the glass ceiling issue of women rising up through the ranks, that there's some problems in certain industries especially. So then we didn't stop at that. We decided we'd do our own study here in the state. So we got Tom Hefty and I can't remember the other fellow's name right now, a couple men on it who were business owners, and a couple women, and we had this, and Carol Skornica and some others, and we did our own survey and had our own report, and had an annual dinner where we would give awards for glass ceiling, awards to companies that broke through it with the people they were appointing. And that went on for a couple of years. That came out of the Women's Council.
And how long did it take you to turn it around from what it was to what you wanted it to be?
Not very long.
Not long.
No, I guess it works. I guess it was, you know, maybe people were open and ready for it. I don't know.
You touched on the criticism you got from certain labor circles. What was your attitude towards organized labor? I noticed one year you introduced the right to work bill.
I was always on the right to work bill anytime it was introduced. And one of the reasons was because I spoke with one of the fellows here who gave me the Idaho example. And that is, in Idaho, they passed right to work legislation, and the union supported it. And the union leaders of that state said, it is not government's role to assure our preservation. They should set the stage that we have the right to talk to workers. If we can't make the case to workers that we have value, then that's their decision, not ours. And that's my feeling on it. I've known good companies run both ways, but I don't think, I think the closed shop is not part of the democratic attitude of this country. So I've always supported it.
I want to ask you about leadership. You were in and out of leadership during your tenure. Any perspective you can raise on that? What are the challenges of legislative leadership?
I think it's very difficult. It's a thankless job because you're always going to have somebody upset with you. You're never going to have everybody happy.
Did you seek it?
Did I seek leadership?
Yeah.
Darn right. Yeah.
Well, why did you seek a thankless job?
Because I wanted to be in the position to help make the decisions about the agenda. I wanted to be in a position to know what was going on, so I'd know better what advice to give or what to do. And when I look back on I did not have a plan for my life. I know a lot of people have these very ornate plans. When they finish college, they're going to do this for 5 years, and then they're going to do that, and then their end game is that. I liken my life to walking down a long hall with many doors. And as I go by, some of those doors open and some don't. And when a door opens, I look in, and if it looks like something I should be doing at the time, I do it. And that's really what I've done. I mean, I never thought I would run for elective office. What did I ever want to do? I did, I think, want to be a lawyer. But unfortunately, people go, oh, fun, courtroom? No, constitutional law. That's where I would have ended up. And,
as a professor, or?
I don't know. I don't know what I would have been. I would have wanted to study constitutional law. What I would do with it, I didn't know. I mean, so I didn't look at anything as a profession. And it was the era, it was my generation. I had a husband who was gainfully employed, so my gainful employment was raising that family, and there were days, I mean, I went gray at 29. They were half the reason. No, I'm kidding. Genetically, that's my dad's side of the family. But it was a full-time job, but I was also a very busy church and civic volunteer and school volunteer during that time, of which we're losing more and more because everybody's working. And so, no, I did not have a plan. I took each opportunity as it came and evaluated and plunged into it or didn't. But when you say, why did you run for leadership? I have to think, why did I run for leadership? Because I thought I could do it.
To have your hands on the lever.
Yeah, I guess that was it.
And you were on Joint Finance.
Yes.
What can you tell me about that committee and your work on that, the workload, what you did?
I loved it. That was a heavy, heavy workload, and it's one of the places that I think you find out if you have valuable staff or not. And you better trust your staff, and you better work hand in glove with your staff. And I don't like the fact that we are, and sometimes legitimately you characterize federal or state legislative staff as running the show, and they let the new legislators come in and go, but they're still running the show. I had a staff person on Joint Finance who came to understand my philosophy. And you know how the working papers go. The working papers come out the night before. You're going to go through an agenda. And when we finally had phones that I could call in so I could talk to them on my hour's drive in, I would say, I would ask I'd call Mike and I'd say, Mike, I want my own amendment.
Mike is a member of your staff?
Yeah, he was my Joint Finance member. I said, I want an amendment. In other words, the various alternatives that the Fiscal Bureau gave me, I didn't like. I had another idea. I resented being hemmed in. That was my first reaction. You get, here's the issue as they define it, and then here's alternative 1, alternative 2, alternative 3.
You had alternative 4.
And I generally, would do something or want to do something on some issues. And we got to the point where I would say, I want to, he said, Margaret, it's in drafting already. He anticipated what I was going to say because he had come to know what I was about. We'd be sitting there for those long, long sessions, and I would turn around to Mike and say, I really want to. He said, I've already asked for it, and he'd hand it to me because he had come to understand me so completely. I find it fascinating right now because I was on Joint Finance during the school choice initiation and startup, the one in '93 when it finally started up. And Gary George in his campaign now running against Gwen Moore is saying, he started it. Oh, God. Nobody's asking me, but I could tell them a story because Joe Leon, our co-chair, and we were a split committee.
You were half and half.
Half and half. And do you know, in the many more than 100 some votes to put that budget together, there were only 14 votes that split on pure partisan lines. I mean, you tell me what's different now? That's what's different now. And so at one point, Joe Leon says to me, I don't know if you remember the room, but you went off a step and into the one co-chairman's office was right there. The majority co-chair, which was Joe, was right there. And Joe says to me, take Gary George in my office and get down to a number he'll accept for the number of positions that they'd allow. So I was the one that did the final negotiating with Gary George. Then he now claims it was his idea, and we were having to hit him over the head to get him to give us some positions. So I'm just having one of these days I'm going to call Gary and say, will you start telling the truth about this story? But anyway, so.
I wonder how he'd react to that.
Well, we got along fine. We did.
So you were appointed lieutenant governor in 2001.
Yes.
And one other thing I wanted to mention is you seem to be constantly through the years mentioned for higher office.
I was asked in '98 to run against Herb Kohl.
I saw some articles in '94.
Good Lord, you've got good resources. I don't have.
She's running for lieutenant governor. She's going to run against McCallum. She's going to run for governor if Tommy doesn't run. This happened again in '98. In 2000, she's running for the Senate. Were you always testing the waters, or were people?
No, people were bringing it to me. I never knocked on anybody's door and said, "I want to run. What do you think?" I never did that. I had people coming to me constantly. I really did. And in '98, they really asked me to run against Herb Kohl. and to the point that I went out to Washington and talked to God knows how many people.
2000 must have been.
Well, whatever year it
Yeah.
was, whatever that year was, right before I got the other appointment. And
How close did you come to running?
close enough to consider and make the trip to Washington to listen. But I decided, I consistently have said and still feel very comfortable with making that decision. Wisconsin is my home. I love this state. I love the people of this state and everything about it. And I didn't have to get out to that crazy place. And I believe it's a crazy place. I really do. I mean, it may be starting, you know, younger would have been different. I don't know. But I love this state. And I have felt honored my entire career to do what I've been able to do right here in Wisconsin.
This was the decisive issue.
Yeah, I
You're
would say. Well,
moving to
that
Washington.
no, and I think part of the problem was they would have worried about, I mean, I would have been a daunting candidate against Herb Kohl. He would have had to spend more money than he did because I think I had enough of a positive track record by then. But I knew by then the nasty campaigning had begun. And I knew votes I took over there on motions that the minority brings up when they're forming a budget and you're in the majority and they start throwing out these motions and then it comes out in a campaign. She voted against whatever their motion was that our entire caucus opposed, but you know, was never having a chance to do anything. And it would make it sound like I was against motherhood and apple pie. And I thought, I nor my family have to go through that. So that was one of the reasons I decided not to. But did I ever want to be governor? Yeah.
You did.
Yeah. I would have loved to have had that opportunity. And that Save Commission book would have been on my desk, and I probably would have been a one-term governor because I would have changed so much that I couldn't have been reelected.
So just hypothetically, if Thompson had bowed out, you would have been in, huh? In 94 or 98.
I would have run probably.
Yeah.
I didn't run for lieutenant governor in that primary against McAllen because I looked at the tea leaves and said, Tommy won't leave. He's so, no. For many reasons, I did not think he would ever take an appointment from George Bush. And his family talked him into it. And that, the rest is history.
You have heard that or you know that?
I'm pretty sure
You're
that
pretty
that's
sure.
the fact. I think they wanted him to satisfy his need to go to Washington, and it was a legitimate need, and he was a marvelous. I don't think that Department of Health and Human Services has ever had a secretary as active and large as it is now that got hands around it as well as he did. He really, really did. And so he can be happy, and he kind of took off in a new side of his career with all his medical knowledge now. But I did not think he would have done that. I don't know what I would have done if I knew for sure he would possibly have left. But I love McCallum's answer when he appointed me. And he said, you know, I'm going to be asked why me when I almost ran against him. And it was the first question he was asked at the press conference in his conference room when we walked out the door. And his answer was a clever one, I thought, that he wanted someone who really wanted the job. Just at the different time than I wanted it originally.
Did you consider turning him down?
I thought about it. I mean, I considered the request seriously. And I weighed. I never knew how I'd get off the stage. I never knew what would cause me to leave. If it would be ill health or something. You know, I was up in years. He didn't realize that. He did realize it, but he wouldn't believe it. Because he kept saying to me after I was in office, he'd say, "Are you really 68?" I felt like saying, "What do you think? I've got 2 birth certificates?" No, so it was a marvelous way to end the career. I so enjoyed those 2 years. I so enjoyed, we were very tight on funds. We didn't use the planes much. There was a lot of criticism about everything he was doing.
What did you do in those 2 years that was enjoyable?
I drove 160,000 miles by myself in this state in my car. 160,000 miles in one.
Was that part of the
18-month
'02 political campaign, or
No,
was it part of your
this
duties?
was from, I started literally in February when he appointed me, even though I didn't take office till May, because Chuck Qualla wouldn't bring my
I was
nomination
going to ask you
up.
about that, yeah.
He said he had to get to know me better. We had worked together for 12 years by then. Maybe he was getting back at me for what I did to him at the Women's Council, I don't know. But anyway, he finally, his members insisted he bring my nomination up, because they were getting beat up at home by their home press and by their constituents who felt, you know, even the Democrats. And so he brought me up, brought my nomination up. I walked up on the floor that morning. He was in control. They were in the majority again. And I walked by him as I was going to my assistant leader's seat, and he said, Margaret, well, I'm bringing it up today, but you know I'm not going to vote for you. I can't vote for you. And I said, like, it bothers me. You
didn't even know the vote was coming up?
Oh, no, I knew.
He
did finally
okay.
put it on the agenda, and it was
right.
coming up, so I knew it was coming up. And he said, but I can't vote for you. And I said, like, you know, what do you want me to say? And then he said the most amazing thing to me, but I voted for your husband when John was up for PSC. So that was supposed to make the little lady feel fine because you voted for my husband. Never mind. Chuck's an interesting character. The interesting thing was a high school class from Brookfield Central High School was there, or Brookfield East High School was there, from my home district. And he got up and railed on me for 45 minutes on the floor. The most insulting diatribe that you ever wanted to hear. And I mean, that I thought showed the smallness of the man, because he couldn't change the fact that I was taking the office. I wasn't going to be his lieutenant governor. I was being lieutenant governor of the Republican governor. So, you know, it was interesting. And my colleagues kept saying to me, get off the floor. I said, no, I'm going to sit here and stare at him the whole time he's doing it, and I did. So that was the swan song in the Senate.
And there were very few dissenting votes in the end.
Yeah, and Gwen Moore voted against me, and she has said to others later, a couple of years later, she said to some women, the one vote, when she had moved to Congress, to the House, she said, the one vote I regret, and I believe her, the one vote I regret in the time I was in the state legislature was my vote against Margaret Farrow. She said, I was the nominal head of the Black Caucus at the time, and all the blacks in the assembly had voted against her, and I felt I had to vote against her, and I was wrong. And I thought that was interesting. Yeah, I got enough votes to pass.
So you enjoyed your 2 years as lieutenant governor, or 18 months, whatever it was.
I loved it. I loved seeing. Every time I thought I, by then, really knew the state, I didn't. I had some of the most amazing experiences in some of the most amazing places. I was asked to give a speech at a farm bureau and I don't remember the community, right across from Winona, Minnesota, on the river, the Wisconsin community, up on a bluff. So I fly in that night. I had to fly in that day. We didn't use the planes very much at all. And I had a staff person with me who didn't like small planes. The poor guy was just about ready to die because it was a bumpy night. And we were flying over at the last minute because I had had a crazy busy day. The daughter of the woman head of the Farm Bureau met us at the Winona airport. And we had to go down because you're up on the, you know, the whole land topography there is so different. But the pilot yells back into the cabin saying, it's going to be a bit bumpy going down, so be sure you're belted in well. And we're going, and a couple of times you thought, is the next bump going to end up on the landing strip? Because it was really some drops. All right, the woman gets us up the bluff on the other side of the river to what would be a typical roadhouse in Wisconsin, you know, with a kind of ballroom in the back, and you know, a big room, and where probably wedding receptions were held. There was the Farm Bureau meeting for that county or something, and I was there to address them after dinner. So we walk into the, and they rush me through the food line because everybody has their food by then. I'm late arriving, and this marvelous woman, widowed about less than a year, and she's in her 80s, who is the head of the Farm Bureau, and it's her daughter, and she's got a big family, and they all live in the area, and whatever. She's getting, make sure I get, and yeah, the food was fantastic, fried chicken and squash and all this. And so I'm eating, I'm hungry, so I always could eat before I had to speak. Some people said they can't. So I'm saying to her, this squash is marvelous. And she said, picked it this morning and brought it over here and told them to cook it up. She was the most marvelous woman, just a whole different, and it was, the whole evening was just something you would not, on the other side of the state, anticipate you would find in Wisconsin. You know, I'd love to have taken all the people I know and say, come on, I want you to have this great experience with me about another part of Wisconsin. I'd loved it. So I really enjoyed it very much.
The office doesn't really have duties as such.
No, it just serves in waiting, taking the pulse of the governor every morning, people kid. No, it has no duties. And you do whatever the governor decides you should do. And I think, for example, right now, I think Rebecca Clayfish has moved into a very good spot. I think this governor has a lot of trust in her, and I think she's doing a darn good job with the business. And now she and oh God, this is awful. I'm thinking of too many things all at once. But the Department of Revenue Secretary Rick Chandler and she are going around really looking into people's feelings on taxes and bringing a whole attitude of that back for the budget discussions coming up. I think she's done a good job, and I had the chance with Governor McCallum to do some of the same. I did a number of representations of him at things that he couldn't be at. He asked me, for example, things we don't know and don't talk about enough in this state. We have an awful lot of space-related businesses, and there is a group of states that formed the Aerospace States Association, done by the lieutenant governors and corporations and educational institutions in states. There are 22 states in it, and Wisconsin is one of the very active states. I would have been the chairman of it the next term if I had been reelected, and a lieutenant governor, I mean. And it's fascinating. And I was at a meeting of that body in Washington. That was the only thing I traveled to Washington to do. In the time I was in office, I did not go to the national conference of lieutenant governors. We did nothing that took extra money out of the Treasury. And anyway, so I went to Washington to several of those meetings. They were held in a boardroom, a conference room, in a law firm near the White House. And I was there at that meeting on 9/11.
You were in Washington? Yeah,
I was in Washington. In fact, I was having breakfast at the JW Marriott with a fellow from the Wisconsin group on the board, a private businessman, and a fellow from JW Marriott Hotels. And we were having breakfast up on the balcony of their coffee shop. And I looked over at the bar area that was closed, but their TVs were on. And I saw the smoke coming out of the World Trade Center. And I said, I could see it, they couldn't. And I said, I think something's happened. And we walked over and watched it, and then sat down again. And then when I saw the second plane go in, and the fellow from the JW Marriott, I never saw, you hear this in, but you've never seen it, blood drain out of someone's face and someone just go white. He went white, and he said, we have a hotel at the base of the World Trade Towers, and all he could think of was his staff and his guests, and he excused himself. I mean, it was, and we were hearing the jets. They were afraid of car bombs. We were hearing the booms, and it was the jet plane scrambling up quickly to fly a cover over Washington, where they normally wouldn't go through the sound barrier over the city, but they weren't even thinking about that at the time. It was a day I'll never forget. It really was. It was fascinating. And they told me to go back to the hotel and hunker down. They went into panic in the East Wing here. My staff said they were going, Margaret's there alone without security, all by herself. Well, Margaret can handle herself. And one of the members of the council of this group was from Highland Park, a young Hispanic woman whose black belt karate I had known. I thought, she and I are staying real close together, and she'll get me through anything. So we ended up, he had taken a car out from the state when Tommy was working on welfare reform in the Clinton administration time. And it was sitting there because nobody had time to drive it back. It was a big Yukon. And so the John Murray, who was head of the office at the time, was told to go in or to get somebody to get the car out to him. And one of his staff members had gone home. He lives in Washington because no one could come into Washington. And I still worry about that poor young man because he drove the car out to John Murray, who was out in Arlington, and he took the car out to him, and then John came around. We went home with a fellow to his condo from this meeting, and we left his condo in Maryland at 6:30 at night, drove through the night, and I was home in Pewaukee at 6:30 the next morning. not worrying about trying to rent a car or anything. It was I wanted to get home to Wisconsin. That was my first reaction. I want to get home.
So in 2002, the McCallum-Farrow ticket ran for re-election, and you lost. Can you describe the campaign?
The campaign was fascinating and hectic, and again, I was seeing more of the state, talking to people. You know, we're such a balanced state. I didn't have a negative feeling about it. I went into it certainly wanting our ticket to win. But so often you see the state move back and forth, you know, from Tony Earl to Tommy, and now to Jim Doyle, and now to Walker, and what'll come after that, because we are so almost equally divided. So I felt badly, and I can't say I was shocked.
You were not shocked?
I was not shocked. I knew polling. I knew that we had drawn very, very close. We had started out behind, and we drove within 10 days we were even. And then an awful lot of money was put in by several large groups against us, and some pretty heavy-hitting ads against the governor. And the rest was history.
And you lost. Do you think it was just the spirit of the times?
I think there was quite a bit of that, yeah. I really do. As I say, I think a lot of it is the balance of the state. And then we went into the lame duck period after that. And I have one neat memory about that. I got to ride a Black Hawk helicopter up to Berlin, Wisconsin to see one of the troop deployments. The superintendent of schools of the Berlin schools didn't want it done in the armory where they were going to do it. He said, I want it in the school gym, and I'm going to bring the whole school, the grade schools here to the high school, and we're going to all watch it and understand what these guys are offering. These women are going to sacrifice and offer going off to war. And their families were sitting down on the floor of the gym with the troops, and the kids were all around on the bleachers. It was and the Black Hawk landed on the football field. I think some of the kids coming in on school buses were as fascinated by that and I was. It was a marvelous experience for me. I was very proud. That
was during your lame duck period?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there, who are some of the most memorable figures in your tenure public service?
Ooh. That's a challenge.
You've already mentioned quite a few.
Yeah. Well, I'm even going to mention some other ones, though, that you might find surprising. When I was coming out here as a local official, I watched Mary Lou Muntz, who was a legislator, attorney, and then a public service commissioner, who politically, philosophically, I'm probably on the totally opposite side of. And someone said to me once, no one will ever beat her at anything because she works so hard. And she'll win her point, or she'll win the election, or she'll this or that. And I thought, gosh, that's a great thing to have someone say about you, that you'll earn what you get by hard work. When I was leaving, someone said that to me about me. And I thought, I don't know if that's true, but it kind of feels good that I worked that hard. But I admired Mary Lou the way she dealt with everyone. I admire Tommy Thompson because of what he was able to accomplish in so many ways with the Democratic majority that he was opposing him an awful lot, and how he could work through agreements with them and make things happen and keep the state moving forward. I don't think we'll ever have as good a salesman for the state of Wisconsin as we had for Tommy. He really loves this state, and it came out of every fiber of his being. I guess I really have heroes that go way back in my own education, and that made me maybe think like as I do. My dad raised me not to be a woman limited by things. He never said, oh, you can't do that because you're a girl. I played every sport. I learned how to run an outboard motor when not many people even had little crazy outboard motors. I was in the middle of everything, and Dad never limited me. And he only said, you're going to learn from your own mistakes. So go do things, and then remember if it didn't work, what you did wrong. But one of my real heroines is St. Catherine of Siena, coming out of my Catholic education, the namesake of my high school. But she told the Pope to go back to Rome when he was living in Avignon, France. She's a doctor of the church, a theologian. And everything I ever read about her, I thought, that is one special lady. Margaret Thatcher. Huge respect for Margaret Thatcher. And way back when I was a very young girl, just getting this fire of public policy, Claire Booth Luce, who was a legislator in the federal level, I just thought she was such a lady and so bright and so well-spoken. Yeah, there are a lot of people of that type that had an impact on me. There was a newswoman in a day when there weren't newswomen called Pauline Frederick on NBC that ended up, her final part of her career, she was the newswoman reporting from the UN. Just brilliant, well-spoken, and very much out of the norm because they were all men. But she never was there as a woman. She didn't, say, "Look at me, I'm a woman. I put earrings on and I this." No, she wasn't that way at all. She was just. So I guess that's where a lot of what I maybe ended up being came from.
Over your course of your legislative career, how do you think the institution changed or has changed since?
Well, I think technology has changed it. When I came in, I had one of the first cell phones. My husband gave it to me for security. There was only a cell. This was '87.
Mm-hmm.
There was a cell from Milwaukee to Johnson Creek, and there was no other cell in the state. And he gave me this Radio Shack that had this big lead battery on one side and the phone on the other that hooked up like a regular phone.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if he wanted me to use it as a weapon or what he meant by security, because there was so little cell that I could have yelled for help, traveling alone. But I could have hit anybody with this thing and probably more than knocked them out. And so I saw cell phones come in. We went from typewriters to word processors, and then we went to linked, systems. But emails changed a lot. You used to get nicely written letters that hopefully were held overnight before they were sent by irate constituents, and maybe half of them weren't sent as a result. Emails, it was, they were mad. They went to the computer and they fired off, not even saying, "Dear so-and-so." It was like they were right in the middle of a conversation and they just let you have it with all four barrels. Hopefully some of them regretted what they said because it was foolishness in some cases. But the informality of it has caused, it's made it more guttural. And I think the constant need for headlines, 24/7, people have to know. They can get on their computers and they can read what the paper is already putting out, some of which never hits the dead tree, as they say, because it's just online. There's, the true journalist has to have two sources. Internet people and the social media people don't even need one source. All they need is something going through the breeze above their head. They'll take enough to talk about it. So there's been some very, I think, unfortunate changes. I really do. There's less reserve, less thoughtfulness, a lot more knee-jerk. Let's pull the trigger and let this happen, and then they think later maybe it wasn't a good idea. It's the immediacy, it seems.
Is there anything you'd hope to accomplish that you didn't accomplish? We've already talked about SAVE. You mean
oh yeah, I probably would have liked all those things to work better, but that isn't the way I think anymore. And now I've got a son doing it, so he can pick it up and do it. And it's so funny because he came to me. He had been on his school board, and he came to us and said when Rich Zipper was going to run for the state senate, he said, "I'm going to." And he was Rich's treasurer.
Were you encouraging?
Yeah, I was shocked. I asked him to think about it seriously with his wife because it's a joint effort. If you don't have a spouse that's supporting you, I saw enough of that in the building across the street. If your spouse isn't supporting you, it's really, really difficult. And I had a marvelous spouse, totally supporting. And in addition, my alter ego, I could go to him and expect intelligent answers to questions I was asking about factual things. So when Paul said he was going to do it, we encouraged him and we helped him, and all the grunt work, all the the signs and what have you.
Do you give him advice, or is it hands-off?
Yeah, only when he asks. Only when he asks. If he asks to this day, he knows I'm there for him anytime. If he has an issue that he just wants to run by, something he's doing or something that happened. If you had asked me 10 years ago which of our 5 sons would be in this position, I wouldn't have picked Paul.
Really?
But I don't think any one of them could do it any better than he's doing it. He's just made us both very, very proud. Absolutely. He's almost an old-fashioned legislator in the way he gives respect to everyone. And I don't think there's enough of that.
I read that you're a muskie fisherman.
Oh, yes.
It's the fish of 1,000 casts, they
Yeah,
say.
10,000 casts.
10,000
casts.
10,000?
And
Is that true?
Oh, yes.
Does that affect your outlook as a public servant or legislator?
I learned with my dad, and then I didn't do it for a long time because my husband doesn't fish. And I was at a Tommy Thompson birthday, and several women came up to me at one of his birthday events and said, do you know anybody who fishes? Because we're trying to put a team together for the Minocqua Muskie Hunt, the World Muskie Hunt. And I said, I do. But I hadn't had a rod in my hand for 20 years. And that's what got me going again. And then the sons, John, Peter, and Paul, formed a team. And they subsequently were in the tournament. And Paul and John had been president of the group. And John this year is the honorary guide of the group for the tournament. And I have caught about 6 legal size and won a couple contests. My biggest one is 45 inches. And it is a blast. It is just a blast. I just love it. And you understand, all you have to even do is see one following a bait alongside a boat, and you understand why they're a very special fish. They're huge, and they're fun.
Okay. What are you doing now? I mean, I'm seeing you've been very active since you left office as Lieutenant Governor. You've been involved in politics in various ways. You're on the Board of Regents of the University of Wisconsin
That was an
system.
unexpected situation. I did not, and I think I'm probably the most reluctant or unexpected regent that ever was. The governor called last year, had his chief of staff call me and open up the conversation. And I said, no, I don't think I can do that. Called me back. I keep saying no to people, and they don't let it stand. And he called me back. He said, no, we really would like you to do it. And I mean, even then, I had to ask the specifics because I hadn't paid that much attention to the Board of Regents, other than when I was on Joint Finance and having to go, through their budget and what have you. I didn't realize the terms were 7 years. I mean, I keep saying I'm not going to live for the length of this.
That will carry you through a while.
It'll keep you busy. And I don't tend to do things partially. I do them all or not. I had a real estate salesman license, tried to do it part-time, didn't work. You have to be full-time to make it be effective with your customers. So if I can't be doing it well, I won't do it. And this has to be, I've already been back to 11 of the 13 campuses that I've already visited. Yeah, so I've been traveling quite a bit, and went up to Stout earlier this week for a visioning session that I was asked to attend up there, outside of the actual Board of Regent meetings. And I was on the selection committee for Ray Cross, and I think we have a wonderful president. I expect great things in the next couple of years. So, but it's almost as though I'm back in office with no pay and no staff. That's what I liken it to. It's that time-consuming.
It's that time-consuming.
Yeah, but it's fine.
What about Wisconsin Eye?
Wisconsin Eye is alive and well. We need funding. People don't realize that it's not free. And I was with Tim Carpenter. I was co-chair of the group.
You've been on this for a while.
Yeah, we were the Ledge Council Committee that formed the flesh of it. And then it was put out for bid through DOA to have a private entity be the licensee. And Jeff Roberts started it, but didn't get it accomplished. And then the board was enlarged, and at the first meeting, Tom Loftus was the chair of the original board, and he became the interim manager, operations guy. And so they put me in the chair at the first meeting I was at. And we're having our annual meeting next week for this year. We've enlarged the board, and we're fundraising. But people, unfortunately, we put it on the air and people took it for granted.
What's the source of the funding?
Donations.
Donations.
We have some earned revenue, and we're increasing that through sponsorship and what have you, but through sales of the DVDs that you can have shows pulled off and copied for you. We have a way to do it right online. So we're growing, but not to the point where we can support ourselves. We're the only one of the about 22 public networks in the country that receive no state funding. And in the same manner, we have no state control over us. The only way they control us in the building is to adjourn a meeting that we're at, because otherwise we have full right to be there as long as they're in session. And our responsibility is to cover both chambers when they're in session, the Supreme Court when it's in session, and at least one cover every committee of both houses once a term, but we're way beyond that. We do it far more than that. And then do our other programming, our newsmaker interviews and what have you. Yeah, I'm very proud of it. What was driving me was to have quality of the picture so that it looked very professional, and balance to the way we were doing it, so one side or the other wouldn't say, oh, you're really conservative, oh, you're really liberal. Over a period of months, you'll see a complete balance. We work very hard to keep that. So I'm very proud of it, but we keep being close to having to close it down because we haven't reached out enough.
Funding is the problem.
Yeah.
You're happy with the coverage they're doing?
Oh yeah, I'm proud as can be of it. Okay. Yeah, and people have come to accept it in the building. I mean, it's there. I mean, the Act 10 debate, if you recall, when the Senate finally went into the Senate org mode and passed the agenda for the next day to come in and finally vote on it, which is what was needed to finally pass it, they had to close the doors because of the fire requirements that the Senate parlor had become too filled, so they had to close the door to keep people,
This is the org or the conference committee?
This is the org.
Okay.
This is Senate org. They rushed into Senate org to set an agenda for the next day to go in and vote. There was nothing for the public to do in that meeting. At a Senate org or a rules committee by the Assembly.
There's no testimony taken.
Right, exactly. It's just the members of the committee voting on the agenda. But it was, the public that were opposing the whole thing didn't care what was going on. They wanted a right to be there, and they finally had to close the doors so the room didn't become more of a fire hazard than it was, according to them. And the cameras were rolling the whole time. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was a public meeting because anyone could have access to it as it was happening because of Wisconsin Eye. I was proud that happened. And we also are making the first historic record of floor debates. Prior to that, we're one of the few states that make except for the votes, no record of what happens on the floors. The example I use quickly is the lottery vote. When in '87, one of the first votes I took was the second vote of passage, putting it out to referendum to increase the lottery, to create the lottery in the state as part of the Constitution. And when we ended up passing that, then the tribe said, well, it means this. They went to federal court and challenged it. The only way they could know what our intention was in our debate when we passed it was to take depositions from people who spoke.
There's no record of what anybody
No
actually
record.
said.
And now, and Barbara Crabb ruled as she did, which I believe was wrong, because I believe we only meant the lottery. We did not mean anything else with that or have that intention. Now, a judge, without even having it entered into, this is what I've been told by judges, so it's not me, I'm not a lawyer, as you know, but a judge can go to our archives, and it's available at any time, anywhere. You can get through the archives, get to the floor debate you want. They can watch it on their own to enlarge their understanding of the issue, even without it being brought in as testimony. But now you can see exactly what was said. And the various attorneys and judges I've spoken to have said it's basically changed the way we'll do those types of interpretation challenges from now on. So I'm proud of that.
Any other thoughts? Anything else you wanted to add?
No, I hope that, when I look back, my word, when you say 87, I don't, that seems like yesterday to me, and yet to me, people in that building, they weren't born until many years after that right now, and I hope that we preserve what's always made this state so great, and I hope we don't lose it in the face of modern technology and new pressures and everything. So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.